So good evening, everyone. I think we should get started. I welcome you all to the SSAT webinar. I'm Vikas Tudeja. I am a liver pancreas surgeon and chief of surgical oncology at University of Alabama at Birmingham. The current SSAT webinar is focused on one of the key components of academic life of a surgeon: writing grants, securing grants, and then making the best of those grants. My co-moderators include Anthony Villano, surgical oncologist at Fox Chase, and Youngi Wu at City of Hope. She's an expert gastric cancer surgeon as well as a robotic surgeon. I do want to say that SSAT has a great lineup of grants which have jump-started many careers. Please look at the list of grants at the SSAT website. And this particular webinar has been kind of designed in such a way that you can write a good grant and then secure it as well. Also, I want to point out that Resident Research Award, which was due on November, in November, we have extended the deadline for that. And now the new deadline is February 17th. So please, if you are a resident, please apply. If you are a faculty, encourage your residents to apply. At this point, we have a stellar lineup. Dr. Villano, if you want to introduce the first speaker, please.
Absolutely. So I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Heather Yo. Dr. Yo is an associate professor and surgical oncologist at Weill Cornell Medical School, New York Presbyterian, and focuses in colon and rectal surgery. She was a past recipient of 2 SSAT Career Development Awards, one for clinical outcomes with her project entitled Randomized Trial of Postoperative Mobile Applications to Decrease Readmission After Major GI Cancer Surgery, and a recent award for Disparities work entitled Understanding Disparities in Surgical Academic Health Centers and Their Association with Subspecialty Choice. Dr. Yo has published widely in a variety of areas in colorectal surgery, disparities, outcomes improvement, and surgical education. So we're thrilled to have her tonight. Her talk is going to discuss various top types of funding mechanisms available to early career surgeons, intramural, extramural, societal, et cetera. With special mention will be made for the upcoming SSAT grants, their general prerequisites, and the grant submission process. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Yo.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the introduction. I'm really glad to be here. My talk's going to be kind of a quick and dirty general overview. And I think you'll get a lot more detail from the individual things, but really just, I think, understanding the main overarching grant system is super helpful. I don't think I did in my early career. So we're going to go through that as soon as I can get some slides to advance. So the 2 main types of funding opportunities that it's worth kind of splitting things between is internal and external. Internal grants are really institutional grants that are found at your institution. And I'll talk briefly about how to find those, but most of our focus today is going to be on external funding and opportunities, particularly focused for surgical funding. So as you go about your funding process as a new faculty member, kind of one of the important things to do is to talk to people before you start the application process. So talk to your grants office, talk to your grants administrator, make sure that you have signed up for the listservs and the emails. There are, I signed up for a grant email on our internal listserv when I first started at the hospital, and I get a weekly email of grants that the hospital thinks might be relevant and the medical center think might be relevant to me. In addition, it's worth talking to the development staff so they know what kind of research you do if they have donors that might be willing to give you something. And then, of course, talk to your colleagues, which is kind of why we're here to give you this talk today. So internal funding, as I alluded to, it's often donor-based dollars. So making sure that people at your hospital or institution understand your research. CTSCs and T32s are technically external funding that's administered through internal grant funding, but basically are administered through your hospital or through your institution's grant office. And then there are often also other state awards or individual institutional awards that are administered through your internal institution's funding. So again, I'm going to kind of focus on external funding, in particular the NIH and professional society funding, but other things to consider as in your search are foundation grants, charity grants, not-for-profits, commercial businesses. A lot of hospitals have or institutions have organizations or groups that will help you if you want to work with industry. There are state and federal funding calls. I'm not going to go in depth here, but to mention those. And actually, even more recently, I know individuals who've had their research funded through crowdsourcing or like an angel investor / donation. So let's focus on the NIH. Again, Dr. Frankel is going to kind of talk to you in depth about how that works, but I'm going to kind of cover some of the superficial understanding of what the grants are. There are four, there's a lot, but there's four I'm going to just briefly mention here, and I'm going to focus on the top two because those are the ones that matter early in the career, in your career. The first is a Career Development Award. We'll talk about that just a little bit more in depth shortly, as well as the R grants or research grants. The next two are program center grants. So those are something you might be part of in a collaboration or research cooperative agreements. And again, those are more collaborative grants and not focused on individuals or individual research. So what is a K award? There is an entire alphabet soup of different, or I guess numerical soup of different K awards. But the two that are probably most applicable to surgeon scientists are, and you'll see the word there, clinical scientists, right? Where most of us here are not basic scientists. We expect to work with patients. We expect to have a clinical component. And so the K08 is the Mentored Clinical Scientist Research Award. And the K12 is the Clinical Scientist Institutional Career Award. So much like I talked about earlier, even though it's a federal grant, it's administered by the institution. And so there's an application first by the institution and then by you. As I mentioned, there are a large number of Ks. The only other one that I think is worth mentioning to individuals at this program is if you come into your early career with a pretty good research background and some external funding, you might consider the K99 to R00, which is not it's a transitional award to move from early career to more senior practice. So if you have a PhD coming in, if you have some funded research, that might be an opportunity to do the K99 to R0 and skip parts of the kind of mentored training awards. So should you apply for a career development award? I think this is important when you're negotiating your first contract. You really need about 75% FTE support. They've just altered it for surgeons. I believe it now to 50%. You can still get a K, and you also can get additional support for a lot of the other things that you'll do for your research. But it is does cap, and it's a lot of work. And Tim will talk to you about that too. So what is an R award? An R award is if you are successful with a K award, so early award, or the other opportunity is there are some other K-like awards that will fund you for a number of years and you can get your stuff off the ground. The next bastion of funding through the NIH is the R award. And I think probably the only one worth starting with is the R01. I will mention that the small research grants, the R03 and the R21, which are exploratory grants, they are the same amount of work as an R01 and a lot less money. So I think that from my standpoint, unless you're on someone else's small R's, it's probably not worth the effort because as I think maybe I'll talk about, maybe Tim will talk about, when you are starting early, you can either be an early or new investigator and you only get that once. So you don't want to lose it on an award without very much money. All right. So the NIH has a website. Once you know your research, it's worth kind of screening through those. I'm not going to go tell you how to search your research, but basically look, if you know you want one of these awards, start searching and start seeing what's going to be most applicable to you. It's also important to consider which institution you're going to. Again, for many of us, that's the NCI, but for example, for a lot of GI stuff, it might be through NIDDK. Again, the NIH has multiple different ways you can sort and search grants. I think I probably spent a couple of weeks my first year as faculty searching these grants just to understand what they were and where I might get funding. So it's a good thing to do. I don't know if you're sitting at the airport when you're trying to figure stuff out. So professional societies, I'm going to wrap this up soon because we want to keep this panel on time so we can have questions at the end. Professional societies, they almost all have grants. So this was me today. I did a search, Google search. I'm teaching you some important life skills. Search society surgical grants, and you come up with the main players: AAS, ASA, American Surgical, SSAT is a little further down the list, but we are on this first page of the list. So it's worth just searching through there and looking at all the grants and the grant deadlines. When you are early career, we will say this again, apply early and often. Many of these grants are only available in the first 5 years of training. Some go up to 7, some go up to 10, but the clock starts as soon as you start your faculty appointment. SSAT is great. Actually, as mentioned, I've been recipient to 2 awards. It's the reason that I've become really actively involved in SSAT. I didn't know that much about SSAT, and I applied for one of the grants, got the grant, and then realized that I owed them a little bit. So I became a pretty active member, and I've been a member of SSAT ever since. As I said, a number of grants. The 2 that I think should just be mentioned here, the 2 major grants for junior faculty. One is newer. It's the SSAT Healthcare Disparities Research Award, and it's really to help focus our members on disparities related to digestive diseases. And that can be in any context. That can be in health services related research. That can be in any other context, as long as it focuses on a diversity aspect. That's a $20,000 award over 2 years. And obviously details will be on the SSAT website. The SSAT Career Development Award is really the award that most people, I think, really want to try and get. It is for faculty members in basic or clinical research, and it is $50,000 a year over 2 years. So it's real money, and real money that you can get an early project done with. These applications, almost every grant application has a similar format. I think people further down the line are going to go through how to move through that, but you'll keep looking at them and you'll see the same things over and over again. So it's a really good to just get used to the format. So again, internal funding, external funding, and just try and find a home for your grant. That means talking to your mentors, finding people who've been using those areas, read the RFA. People always said contact your program officer. I didn't do that till probably too much later because I had a weird, not very responsive program officer. But just make sure you keep the communication open. So thanks for the rough fly through, and I'm gonna turn it back to, because you're gonna do the next intro, or who's up? I'm gonna stop my share.
Thank you, Heather. That was amazing. Our next speaker is Colin Martin. He's going to talk about Grant Writing 101 tips for a successful award application. Dr. Colin Martin is an associate professor of pediatric surgery at the University of Alabama. There he serves as a surgical director of the UAB Children's of Alabama Center for Advanced Intestinal Rehabilitation. He has a special interest in the role of innate immunity in the intestinal diseases of prematurity. His research interests includes mucosal immunology and B-cell mediated antibody development. He was a past recipient of SSAT Career Development Award for his project entitled Environmental Programming of IgA Transport in Neonatal Disease. In his talk, he's going to talk about the pearls and pitfalls of compiling a successful grant application with brief emphasis on the SSAT Career Development Award. Colin.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Can you see my slides okay? Okay. It's a pleasure to be here. I have no disclosures. So Reggie Jackson was one of the greatest baseball players of his generation, had a lot of home runs, but he also led the major leagues in strikeouts. So you have someone who is a great home run hitter, but also led the major leagues in strikeouts. And to Dr. Yo's theme, getting grants, there's a 0% chance you're going to get a grant if you don't apply. So we have to apply, even if we don't think we're ready, we have to apply often. So a checklist before you start writing any grants, career development grants, Ks, Rs. I think the first thing is just family and self-care first. I think we have to be at our best to fulfill the tripartite mission that some of us espouse to do. And so when we're pulled at work with clinical care, grant writing, research, some things can suffer. So I would say just be sure that you're taking care of yourself and your loved ones. Get organized, very important. So many things are going on. Your plate is full. You don't want anything important to be dropped. Meetings, deadlines, and so figure out the best way to get organized. Find your local and outside team and mentors. Very important to have a group of people who care about you, who can offer you advice, and not always tell you what you want to hear. Agreed upon the terms of success. So as you write grants, understand, why are you writing these grants? Is it to get promoted? Is it to get money for a research program? And those terms of success should be yours, as well as your mentors and your chair. And also have short, mid, and long-term goals. So career development award might be a short-term goal, then you go to a K, then an R, but just understand what that looks like. So our research program is critical. This is what I study in my research lab. I think you have to have good research in order to have good grants. And so these are some of the things that I've done to sort of develop my research program, and it's also helped me to get grant ideas. So talking about your work all the time is so important, even talking to the community. We've given talks at the local libraries, and some of the questions we got from local people in the community have led to new grant ideas. These are some of the societal grants I was able to obtain from the AAS, the SSAT, of course, and the American Surgical Association, and also start serving on study sections if you have the opportunity. Very, very important to help with your grant writing. So these are some of the surgical societies that have been helpful for my career in grant writing development. And when you're getting started, it's very important to know the external and internal deadlines. And so at UAB and at many other institutions, if the deadline is a certain date, the internal folks are going to want that grant in their hands likely 5 to 7 days before the deadline. So you might have time to do some extra editing, but you need to have that grant done in time. Schedule time for writing. That's just something that I've done where as things get busy, you have administrative responsibilities. This time of year, there are a lot of holiday parties and holiday events at my kids' schools. You have clinical duties. And so you have to figure out, when are you going to do your best writing? And also when you schedule your time for writing, you know your body and your system and how you think best. And are you a better writer in the morning, late at night, and try to work around your optimal time for writing. And assemble a team, very important. Some early funding pearls. It's hard to write a brand new grant. So look at examples and repurpose grants. I think almost every grant that I've written, there's some sentence or paragraph that came from my early grants. And so each grant that I get, I change, I alter, I improve it. And so it's hard to start brand new. Get feedback early as you're writing grants, and that feedback can come from people on your team, external advisors, but you don't want to sort of spend a lot of time going through a grant and then have someone look at it and there's a fatal flaw in your methodology. Most grants don't get funded, which is another theme, so we got to understand that. And contact past winners. And so the grants that I was able to obtain, I contacted people who got it before me, and I was very willing to pay that forward to people who are applying after I received that award. So the SSAT, this is a very important. I think the grant application starts before the grant application. So what that means is, when you're applying for these surgical society grants, the people that are reviewing your grants are SSAT members and leadership. So if you have two grants that are very, very similar in their rigor, their formatting, everything, if your grant if you're one person that comes to the SSAT all the time, you're involved, you ask questions, you show up, there's probably going to be some bias towards the person who's active in a society. And that's just my thought. Some people may disagree, but that's my thought. So service and participation, I think, enhances your chances of getting a grant. The leadership reviews the grant. Don't expect feedback. And so you may be able to ask for feedback, but it's usually not given for these career development grants. Sometimes there's an interview process, and look at previous winners. And very important, the last bullet is explain the need. Some of these early career development awards, some of us very early in our careers have had great success. And so you've been able to get a K when you're a fellow and a R01 in your first couple of years. That's not my story. But when you're applying for these career development awards that might be 50,000, 75,000, and your CV says that you have millions of dollars of external funding, it's going to sometimes hard to get those grants. And so you got to explain how this grant is going to really propel your career, both with the resources and the opportunities. So assembling a team is very important. And so on the team, you know, you have a coach and you have your PI. Michael Jordan is the PI of a team. You have your coach, but you have to have people around you that are going to be able to help you with stats, be able to help you with editing, be able to help you with formatting graphs, graphic designers, drawing figures. And having a nice team of individuals that really support you is very important. So my writing approach, understanding the directions, the career development plan, and request letters and chair support. So the first thing I do is when I'm writing a grant, I email my chair or other people who need to support it and say, hey, do you mind writing this letter of support for me? Often our chairs and mentors are very busy, and often a draft letter of support is needed, which is very helpful to get things done on time. So the spec aims is where I start. I let my mentors review my spec aims, and the people who review your spec aims, you have to have two groups of people who review your spec aims. For example, if my chair is a basic scientist and my spec aims is at a version where it is not as mature as I would like, you might want to have someone else review that before he sees it, you know, because we're being evaluated and judged all the time. For the spec aims, I think it's good to write with simple writing. You have complex research with simple writing. Formatting, very important. Follow the rules, clean figures, and think about the reviewers. The reviewers who review your grants, they're not just reviewing your grant, they might be reviewing 5 to 7 grants. And many of us are busy, so we're reviewing 5 to 7 grants in a short period of time. So if you open a grant and it's not formatted well, there's very little text, it's very dense, it just kind of puts us in a different mindset versus a grant that's well formatted, has very nice figures. It's very helpful for the reviewers. And then the review. This is the review that before you send the grant out for submission, get internal feedback, give the mentors time. Very important for the mentors to have several days to review the grant. It's very unfair to ask your mentor to review a grant when it's due tomorrow. So choose your own adventure. So when your grant was funded, my grant was funded, you know, thank your team, publicize. And if you were to publicize your grant, you might ask people to amplify it, build for the next grant, use the resources to hire time, to buy time, and also use the grant to enhance your leadership, both locally and nationally. If your grant was not funded, which most are not, as we spoke earlier, seek feedback, keep submitting, and resubmit soon. It's very important to keep in the cycle of submission, hopefully funded, submission, hopefully funded. When you go several cycles or years without funding, you sort of get out of the practice of submitting grants. And this is my final slide. I think networking is very important for grant writing, grant success. And so I'm a pediatric surgeon, I'm a basic scientist. I've met some of the people on the panel at different meetings, and their research is very different than mine. This picture is myself and my family and Carl Villamoria's family, just, you know, networking at meetings, spending time together. And what this allows me to do is to understand how people think, understand their scientific approaches, and see what we can share, what bi-directional mentoring can happen between the two of us. And so when you go to meetings, very important to, you know, just hang out with people that you already know how they think. And so when I go to meetings, I know I spend a lot of time with Dr. Vikas Dujeda. And so I don't really want to spend time with him at meetings. I want to meet new people. You know, I want to find a new tribe to learn from. And these techniques can strengthen your grant writing. And so I really thank you for the opportunity to present, and I look forward to your questions.
Dr. Martin, that was an exceptional, one of the best talks on grant writing I've heard in a long time. So I really enjoyed that. I think it's my pleasure to introduce our third talk of the evening, Dr. Sam Wong. He's going to be talking about making the most of your SSAT Career Development Award and other society funding. Dr. Sam Wong is an associate professor in the Division of Surgical Oncology at UT Southwestern Medical Center. He is a funded investigator whose lab is interested in how normal tissue regenerative processes may go awry and lead to cancer. He also studies molecular mechanisms underlying disparities in outcomes for cancer patients. He's received the SSAT Healthcare Disparities Research Award for his project entitled Identifying Genetic Biomarkers in Hispanic Latino gastric cancer patients, which I love to see the results of, dear and near to my heart. His talk today will discuss how best to leverage awards to jumpstart a research career. He will focus on optimizing funding utilization, successful time management, goal setting for fund duration, and leveraging data for future grants. Dr. Wong?
Yeah, thanks, Yahi, for that introduction. So after you follow the great advice that Heather and Colin provided, and you actually got a grant, I know it's like shocking when you actually get a grant. So what do you do with this? How do you make the most of it? But I think we should just go to the end, right? Where the assumption is we're trying to get to R01 level funding, which is kind of the holy grail of funding. And it allows you to be independent, and it really gives you a stamp of approval, both in the scientific community and also in your institution. So how do you get to that goal? And in terms of all the different types of funding mechanisms that Heather mentioned, you can think about them in kind of a stepwise fashion that allows you to use the different funding mechanisms to get to your goal. And each type of funding requires a certain amount of preliminary data and a certain amount of track record productivity on your end. So let's get to the end. It's like, what do R01 level grants actually look for? And the aims, and I'm going to speak from more of a basic science and translational science standpoint, because that's what I do, but I think the concepts are applicable to health service research, clinical outcome types research. The aims are generally are mechanistic based, and they're hypothesis driven. So that means you need to actually have really high level preliminary data to support your hypothesis. So for example, having been on study sections and reviewing many R01s, oftentimes people may have an aim that says, we will perform some sort of fancy technology on some tissue or patient population, period. For example, we will perform single cell sequencing on pancreas cancer, period. And that's not a really good aim, because it's very a characterization type study, and the words that kind of the kiss of death type of words will be, it's a fishing expedition. So that's not good enough for an R01. Whereas maybe a much more competitive type aim would be based on our preliminary work that we've already done. For example, having done single cell sequencing, we hypothesize that a particular gene is inducing some sort of biological phenomenon like metastasis by going through pathway, whatever. So now there's you now have a hypothesis that you can test. So that's kind of like the goal you're trying to get to with your R01. So that means you need data to get there. So how do you do that? So I think you can use your funding, both your startup type funding and your society or pilot type award grants, to get that kind of data. So that means I generally think that you should do big experiments that gives you a lot of data to mine and a lot of leads to explore, so that you now are able to generate hypothesis based aims. So for example, if you have a whole bunch of samples and you want to do sequencing, whole exome sequencing or RNA sequencing, you should do that. Or like some sort of immune profiling. Or if you're studying some disease process where previous work has always taken place with cell lines and nobody's ever made a transgenic mouse, do that. Go kind of big so that you can generate the preliminary data that that allows you to generate some hypotheses that can be the foundations of your aims. And the career development awards are kind of on a similar vein because as you get your KOA, you're supposed to kind of be building towards an R01. The K-type awards do require higher levels of science, but having sat on study sections for KOA grants, you know, a third of the reviews are looking at you in terms of your previous in terms of your previous training. A third of the scores are looking at your career development grant, career development plans, and then only a third is on your science. So the science does not require as much scrutiny. But when you get to the R1 level study sections, then everything is much more focused on the science part. So you know, talking very much kind of in an abstract, I'll just kind of share my pathway vis-a-vis kind of what I talked about. So I joined the faculty at UT Southwestern in 2014, and I had a startup package. And my clinical partner, Matt Frankel, and he also had a startup package. And what we did was we actually just started a biobank of gastric cancer samples because there just wasn't one available here at UT Southwestern, and it's an area of study that very few people have done. So we used our own money, or our institution's money, to start that process. And also using our institutional startup, we performed a small number of analysis on some of the tissue that we collected, and we got some interesting signals. At which point we started using that data to apply for society level grants, including the SSAT Health Disparity Award. So that data we were able to generate allow me to apply for the SSAT and get that award. And that is some bundle of money that allowed me to sequence even more tissue and generate more data. But also importantly, Colin mentioned this as well, getting this type of grant allows you to buy time. It's you know, being a surgeon scientist is challenging for various reasons. People are a little bit skeptical about what you're doing, but getting an award just gets you more credibility, tells everybody, oh, he or she is doing okay. Okay, you know, they're on the pathway. So it gives you more time to keep doing what you're doing. And with this data, with this society award, we're able to kind of do a bigger analysis and then able to publish this data in a paper that now have established a track record of productivity. And this data also allowed us to generate a lot of hypotheses because we just had a lot of data from sequencing. And after a lot of paying, we were able to kind of leverage that to an R01. So that's kind of the pathway like I took. And I think you want to use your money to do something big to generate a lot of data for your application. The other thing I really want to emphasize while you're still in the early career phase is to understand how the study sections work in the R01. And Colin mentioned this as well. I think there's a great program that NIH has is for early career reviewers, where essentially you join a study section, even though you are not funded. You join and you're reviewer 3 of 3. So your opinion doesn't matter that much. And you're only reviewing 3 grants. So it's not that much work, but it really gives you insight into how a study section works. And you hear the words the same criticisms over and over and over again. And having done that myself was really helpful to understand how to kind of set up my experiments in a way to generate the data I need to put in a competitive R01 level grant. So in summary, I would think about when you're putting together your aims, you need to generate for your R01s, you need to ask why and how, not what. So not characterization study. So you can use your pilot level grants, your career development grant to generate the what data. What is the phenotype? What is the sequencing data, to ask why or how type questions. And then I would think you should just like one of the mistakes I made early on was I was trying to save money. I just use your money. Like use the money to get the data and you convert that to bigger money. Don't try to save, don't try to nickel and dime, just use it. And then I think participating in study sections really help because, you're trying to get to an end point, right? Which is to get R01. Trying to get every piece of information you can will be really, really helpful. And serving on the study section gives you a kind of behind the curtain look at how this works. So with that, I'm going to turn that back to Dr. Dudejas.
Tony, you're introducing the next speaker, please.
Yep, and we have one more speaker to go, and I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Timothy Frankel. So Dr. Frankel is an associate professor in the Division of Surgical Oncology at the University of Michigan. He's a funded surgeon scientist whose laboratory studies the characterization and manipulation of the tumor microenvironment in pancreatic cancer. Through this, the lab explores the role of tumor-derived microvesicles in the expansion of myeloid-derived suppressor cells and tumor-associated macrophages. Amongst many awards, he's a past recipient of the NIH Clinical Scientist Career Development Award, which is a prestigious 5-year NIH funding mechanism. We're excited for his talk because it will discuss the grant preparation process specific for NIH funding, including various types of grants, institutes, and important terminology. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Frankel.
Great, thanks so much for the introduction. A lot of people have gone over parts of this in their prior talks, and so I'm going to sort of summarize what I think the strategy is for writing a good NIH grant, and really all grants you write have pretty much the similar recipe. It just may vary on the amount of emphasis placed on one or the other, and I'll talk about that sort of closer to the end. So the general rules for grant writing, particularly NIH grants, there's a lot of paperwork involved. So the grant itself is typically 12 pages for something like an R01, but the actual grant that gets handed in is about 110 pages. So all of that is sort of procedural paperwork that needs to be collated typically by a grants office. The grants are not made out to the individual, they're made out to the university, and as such, the university is on the hook for misconduct or for anything that's done, against NIH principles. So they're going to want to review, somebody in the university office is going to want to review all of these grants ahead of time. And so it's very important to reach out to your grants management team or the surgery research office very early on in the process so that they can have a opportunity to share deadlines with you to make sure that everything gets taken care of and can get to the appropriate signing officials in time to submit the grant. There's nothing worse than writing an entire grant only to find out that the university won't let you submit it because it hasn't had enough time to review it. So reach out early. Find a good person to work with if you're not already assigned one, and they can be a huge resource for you, even just to keep you on track. The other thing that I think is very important, again, for NIH grants, but for any grants, is always to start with a chalk talk. So this is something that's very common in the basic science realm, although becoming increasingly common in health services research. But you want to really have a talk where you bring together people who are close to your project and a little bit further away from your project, people who've maybe sat on study sections before, who you can sort of pitch your idea, elevator pitch your idea in the highest level views, just to see whether or not there's even interest. If you present this and people say, yeah, somebody looked at that 10 years ago, then you will save yourself a lot of trouble, by not having to slog through a long grant that's ultimately not going to get funded. The quickest time to realize a grant is not a good grant is before you start writing it. Then you want to really, from that chalk talk, you want to gather your thoughts and gather the opinions of others, and you want to put together a specific aims page. This is the most important part of every grant. This is sort of a written version of your elevator pitch. I tend to break my specific aims pages into this exact schema here. And so you really want to start with the question up front. Why are you asking this question? Why is it so important? If somebody gets to that first paragraph and they think that that's not a great question, the entire rest of the grant is unlikely to get funded. So it's really important to have that hook early on. Then you want to cover a little bit of background only as it pertains to the question that you're asking, and then the specific aims that you're going to cover, and then anticipated outcomes. Then you want to get that page. So you've had your chalk talk, you want to get that page and you want to circulate that page around at minimum to the people who are on your, who were at your chalk talk. But really to anyone who will listen, people who, again, find people in the department who've had experience and grant funding, so that they can really proofread it and it'll give them an opportunity to critique and say, you know what, this aim seems a little bit weak. You're going to need to, bolster that up. Again, you want that aim page to be perfect and accepted by everyone before you start writing the grant, because you don't want to waste your time having to change stuff later on. And then you start writing. This process is, it can be a lengthy one. Everybody has sort of a different way of starting their grants and the order in which they write things. And I'm just going to go over some sections here. The first portion of a grant is typically the significance section. This is where you cover the background information and you give the reviewer just enough information or as much information as you think they need to really understand the context of your question. And then also what you're going to, the experiments and so forth, you're going to be proposing. I always write this last, because if you write it first, it tends to be sort of a book report and you write 2 pages like you're writing a review article, and it wastes space and it will end up including a lot of things that you don't need the reviewer to know. If you write it at the end, then I need to make sure from these different sections that I cover enough material. Increasingly important these days are the innovation section. This is where you really show how novel your work is. I usually break mine into these 3 bullets, and I'm very explicit. I say, this is biologically innovative because, this is technically innovative because we have assembled an innovative team of these individuals. And again, just spell it out for the reviewer so they don't have to really think about it. Rigor and reproducibility, again, and this is a required part of every NIH grant now. This is when you describe things like sample size, the amount of replicates you're going to use, and then consideration of variables such as sex and race. This is very important and is required for most NIH grants. And really, it is in response to criticism that much of the research that is done in this country is not reproducible by other labs. Then you want to, again, give your background and preliminary data. This should be focused on the enhancing the significance of the research, but also, and as important, demonstrating the feasibility. So if you're going to propose growing organoids and you've never published on growing organoids before, you need to present some data to show that you know how to grow organoids, because a reviewer will very quickly say, I don't think they can do this. And therefore, since the whole grant hinges on that, everything will fall apart if that doesn't work. And so this becomes, an important part of sort of grantsmanship, and these are things that good mentors and prior grant awardees can really help you with, and as can other members of your team and your mentorship team. And then you want to get into the bulk of the grant, which is what you're going to actually do if you get the money. Everybody has different ways of breaking up their research strategy section. It can be, for those who review grants, and I love Sam's idea of sitting on these study sections, because it really does show you sort of how the sausage is made. But this can be the most monotonous part of any grant to read, because it really is just explaining experiments. So if you can put it in a context that keeps them drawn into the actual science and into what you're trying to do, it will go a long way. It's also helpful to break this section up by including some schemas and some things that will portray what you're going to do in a graphical form as opposed to a written form, because again, otherwise people sort of can get very lost in the technical jargon and so forth. And then I always include a timeline at the end of my grants. Again, this justifies why you need 5 years worth of funding. I have yet to have any of my grants cut, down year-wise. And I think a lot of it is because I include these timelines at the end. So specific grants at NIH have specific sections that need to be covered. So a KO8 or a Career Development Award needs a career development plan. It's actually judged on the same, it's worth essentially the same amount as the scientific plan. So this should be very, very crisp. It's an area where you have a great opportunity to highlight what your plans are, and it doesn't require any experiments or anything like that. It really is just a description of how you're going to develop yourself into a scientist and transition to independent funding. I would highly recommend finding career development plans of people at your institution who've been successful in getting KO8s, because the coursework that they propose, the training that they propose should all be available at that institution, and is a nice thing to include. U01s and PO1s, these are collaborative grants. So they're either a single institution or multi-institution collaborative grants, and every one of these grants has to also have a statement of collaboration explaining how you will dovetail your findings and your work into the other projects and what the common themes are amongst them. SPORE and PO1 grants also, there are typically 3 projects in each grants, which are really equivalent to 3 R01s, but then also 3 or 4 cores, which are also funded at sometimes close to R01 levels. And so these grants, really, it's important to show some evidence of crosstalk and communication between the different parts of that grant. There are not many of us that certainly not at the junior level who are going to be leading SPOREs and PO1s, but you may be included as a potential co-investigator or co-principal investigator. The other thing that I'll say, and probably the most important thing, find a good team to work with and consider multi-PI grants, particularly when investigators are very well established and they're have plenty of funding to keep their own lab going. They can be interested in these multi-PI opportunities where they can partner with you. You guys put in the grant together, and you get a lot of the benefit of their experience and name, really, in the NIH process. So that's an important thing to consider. You need to be wary, though, of the early investigator status. So if you are on a multi-PI grant, you cannot use your ESI on the multi-PI grant unless your co-mentor is also ESI, and you will then lose it for all future grant applications. So definitely something to keep in mind. And that's all I have, and happy to take any questions in the next phase.
At this time, we will open the panel for discussion and any questions that may come up. I do want to make an announcement. Dr. Al-Rafai mentioned in the chat box that initially Dr. Yeo and Dr. Martin had mentioned that the society grants typically do not offer a lot of feedback. We are changing that in SSAT, and we will strive to provide a feedback so that the applicants, if they are not funded, can improve on their future grants and try to increase the chance of their funding. So please write in the chat box if you have any questions. I will actually open the panel by asking a question. So Tim, you have, there was not a lot of mention about VA Merit Funding Award or mechanism, and I know that you hold one VA Merit Award. Would you please like to elaborate for the benefit of our attendees?
Sure. So
what does it involve?
Sure. So VA Merit Awards are essentially a mechanism offered directly through the VA for essentially an R equivalent award. There's a career development award that they offer, but also an R equivalent award. It requires you to be 5/8 VA. So that's about 30 hours a week dedicated to the VA. Typically between about 2 or 3 of those eighths will be your research project if you get merit funded. And so you will owe some clinical time to the VA for that. You don't need to actually be a VA surgeon or a member of the VA to apply, but there needs to be a letter signed by both the director and your current boss or your department chair that says you will be 5/8 VA funded if 5/8 VA if it does get funded. The grant is almost the exact same. It's written the exact same as an NIH R01 grant, but you do have to deal with the VA research office, which is a little bit more challenging to deal with than often the university research office. They also have to, if your research is done at the university, you'll have to get an offsite waiver, which is not that hard to get. But the regulatory bodies within the VA will review everything that you are doing at the university and can tell you, you may have had a mouse protocol for 5 years, but they may say, no, we don't like the way that this is written. And so you sometimes need to rewrite it, but it can give a great opportunity for another funding stream. The pay line tends to be a little bit better than NCI for sure, although not as better as you would think it would be. But the difference is you're competing with far fewer PhDs because most of the folks who apply for VA merits are MDs, and the study sections therefore are mostly MDs. So that can be a huge benefit. And I know both Vikas and I both have VA merits.
So I do want to add a comment to that VA has multiple mechanisms, including BLRD, which is basic science research, CSRD, which is clinical science, and then there is a health services research track also, and these grants are separately has earmarked funding for them. Let me see if there are any questions in the Q&A session.
Yeah, looks like we have 2. So that's good.
Tony, you wanna please?
I'll kick off the first one, sure. This is from Dr. Iwande Alimi. She asks, how can you describe data that is really anecdotal data that drives the reason you like to explore this question more? I guess what we're kind of getting at there with that question is, say you're writing a grant that doesn't have sort of very discrete preliminary data, but maybe you've noticed something in your practice that may drive an interesting question. For the panelists, how can one maybe mold that into something effective for a basis for your grant?
Sam, why don't you, since you guys have done that essentially at UT Southwestern, I think that sounds like a perfect question for you.
I think it depends on the level type of grant you're trying to get, right? That kind of type of situation where you have an interesting observation and you want to keep following it up, it's perfect for pilot impact grants that many institutions have to kind of get you going. And usually there's some literature out there that would support it. So that's how you can justify it. But that type of research is essentially, like Tim says, how we started our big project. But it's the kind of data that you're talking about it's low level, so it's hard. You won't be competitive at an R or even a K type grant, maybe even a society type grant. I think institutional is good, and if you have startup funding, then that's where you should put your money into it.
Yeah, if I could add to that too, I think one thing is to publish that anecdotal data, just to have something in record that it's peer reviewed and people find it useful. And then also just to get consensus statements around that data, whether it's small surveys, just to have more data to sort of build on it. But I think just kind of starting and letting it snowball.
Yeah, I think the publication, like Colin said, is really important, especially at the K level. You, at least with the National Cancer Institute, you're competing against a lot of PhD or a lot of HEMONC folks who do a lot of research. So everybody essentially has a publication record. So, but the good thing is you don't have to have a Cell Nature Science paper. You just need something in your field. So anything is fine. So you just need to publish. So that's the other point I think we probably all should make is, as you're generating data, just write it up, just put it out there, get your name. Colin said, give talks. really show a track record of productivity and that you're an expert in this field or you're virgin in this field.
There is actually, I kind of not answered it, but it's not showing up as well. There's a question in the chat box that it's a specific for SSAT research proposal, which are typically 8-page long. Are references included in the 8-page count? How to target a proper number of references? And the next point is, are references really looked at during the review process? So I would actually ask this question for Sam and Colin and Heather, who have gotten the award from SSAT in the past. And if you're not able to answer, if you're not aware of the current guidelines, then I have asked the person who asked the question, I put my email there. They can contact me and I can help them find the answer to this. But the question, what is the right number of references? And do the reviewers even look at the references?
I can start. So I think that I believe for the SSAT references were included, but this is an important thing for all the people listening. If you have questions about the formatting, that's what there's always an information number on all of these grants. That's what you should reach out for. And it does matter when you apply for these grants. I mean, all of you who've done NIH awards, like if your page margin's off, if you convert it to a PDF and it rolls over on one line, you can have months of work that is not reviewed. So it is important to ask the question. In terms of deciding the right number of references, I think it really depends on your topic. I think as much as you can cite your own published work, as we already talked about here, that can be helpful, and or seminal papers within the field. I don't think you need to show your knowledge by filling your grant up with references. But I think that you want to make sure that they know you know the literature a little bit. And I do think reviewers look at it. I've had comments from reviewers about references.
Yeah. And I'd also add, if the page limit is 8 pages, you don't have to have 8 pages. It could be 7, 6.5 if it's good. I don't think if it's a little bit shorter, I don't think that's going to hurt you as long as it's a good grant.
Yeah, when I review grants, I tend not to look at references in detail unless something doesn't feel right. Like there's seminal papers in the field, and if the paper's not being described or interpreted correctly, it doesn't feel right to me. I'll look it up. And more often, I'll actually look up the applicants' old papers, just so to get a better sense of like the science they've done before. So you don't have to cite every paper like Heather said, but enough to there's important stuff in your field that you should just put in.
I have one comment. So, as surgeons, we are used to having complications rates less than 5%, and if that even single complication hurt. But in my personal experience, as a grant writer, you have to get used to failures. And success rate typically for NIH or NCI is about 7%. I don't know about that for the SSAT grants, so any comments regarding that for the whole panel? You want to mention that it's okay to fail and keep trying?
If you aren't getting grants turned down, you aren't applying to enough grants. I mean, you should. We all said it, just keep applying. And I think oftentimes people get discouraged if they haven't. I will just say I had one grant that I put in for NIHK, and it got scored, it got reviewed, it got scored, and it did not get funded. But I submitted almost the exact same material to another foundation that had much more dollars attached to it than a K, and ended up getting it for the same project. And so you just never know who's going to decide to take a risk, or who's going to kind of bet on you. And so I think you just have to keep getting your research out there.
Yeah, my R that was funded, I think I submitted 5 or 6 times. And I'm happy to talk to anybody about my journey, about what I did wrong, and help you guys save a few submissions. But I really believed in the project. I found it really important because it was like about my patients here in Dallas. And I just needed to learn how to do better grantmanship. And it took a while to get there. I got it. And, I took a lot. And certainly there are times you want to quit, but like surgery, right? You're definitely going to have complications and grants. You are definitely getting rejected. And you could be like you could be like a great applicant. And just sometimes there's only 2 spots and you're number 3.
Never, ever give up, right? Heather and anybody else who wants to chime in and call in. So I think, we know about the major extramural and federal funding agencies, right? NIH, VA. What I faced the most problem was society funding. Like how, besides asking your colleagues and other people who have gone in the area, and for example, we should apply to SSAT grants, and we are hoping that many people will, and we will have a great turnout. But how do you look for society funding? So like, is there any mechanism that you use? I have used in the past is Proposal Central. So they have a lot of funding for society mentioned on their site. Is there any other specific websites that you, or some kind of a email list that you sign up on?
I signed up for an institutional email list that we have, I think I mentioned earlier, but there are a lot of other sites that congregate things. I think that AAS has a site with a bunch of different grant listings. I know that I know Michigan has a big list of different potential external funding, but a lot of the big universities do have a list of who they recommend or who their scholars have gotten funded for. And I mean, whatever your preferred search engine is, sit and type some words. Like, it's easy to do while you're watching TV. It's easy to do while you're just kind of brainstorming. Type your topic in, type funding. There are all sorts of like hidden grant foundations you've never heard of. So I think that's also worth looking at publications that are in your field and looking at who's funded them too.
That's great. Colin, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, just I agree with everything Dr. Yo said. And I learned from the comments both of you guys made. And I would say in terms of the societies, at least the surgical societies, there are so many out there, but I would target the ones where you want to have leadership and traction, and you want to maybe rise in that society. And so really targeting those. There are the career development awards, and there are smaller travel scholarships. There are smaller coaching awards, things like that. And usually the applicant pool for the smaller non-research awards is smaller. And so you have a better chance of showing success within a society. And then you have sort of the same people reviewing your grants for the other awards that they would for the research awards. And so you sort of you're getting your brand out there more. But I would, target the ones where you want to have traction. As a pediatric surgeon, I'm not going to spend a lot of time in the adult colorectal societies, but it's kind of how I approached it.
I do want to make a comment that, for example, in the oncology world, right, we are part of Society of Surgical Oncology, and there are many grant opportunities there. Similarly, there is a medicine side of it. Like, for example, ASCO, which is American Society of Clinical Oncology, that has grants. So always look for the medicine version of your field. For example, SSAT has grants, but then also DDW and AGA has grants. So something to look for. I think we are at the end of our webinar. Let me see if there's any question and unanswered question in the Q&A board, but there's not. So I want to really thank our panelists and my co-moderators for this opportunity, and this has been really good discussion. I hope many of our attendees will apply. This webinar will be available as a recorded version, so people who are not able to attend will be able to see this. And I just want to remind that we have extended the deadline for the President Grant Awards from SSAT to February 17th. Thank you all and have a great evening.